In graph 28.1, we showed why it might be reasonable to assume that voters have single-peaked preferences over certain types of single-dimensional issues. And in graph 28.2, we showed that when voters have such single-peaked preferences, the median voter theorem applies. The theorem does not, however, apply when voters have non-single-peaked preferences, and we'll argue in this graph that there are reasonable circumstances under which we might in fact assume that voter preferences are not single-peaked. Non-single-peaked preferences might look something like this: one peak where y is equal to 0, and another peak later on where y is positive. In this example, we'll again assume that y is public school spending, as we did in some of our language behind graph 28.2. But this time, we'll assume that there's also a private school that the individual could send her children to. If public school spending is 0, the individual would simply send her children to private school. But then, as public school spending increases from 0, she might still send her children to private school because she doesn't think public schools are spending enough money to provide a good education. Thus, initially as public school spending goes up, she becomes worse off because she has to pay taxes for something she doesn't use and still has to pay private school tuition as if there were no public school. This is true up to the public school spending level y lower bar I. At that point, she switches to public school and becomes better off as the public school spends more because she values the additional spending on public schools more than she dislikes the taxes she has to pay. Eventually, we reach a new peak. That peak occurs at the public school spending level yi star. At that point, sufficiently much is being spent on public schools so that the individual does not value additional spending more than she dislikes the additional taxes that such spending implies. Thus, her utility falls as additional public school spending beyond yi star is undertaken. The first peak and the subsequent decline in utility as public school spending increases arises in this case because of the presence of private schools and the fact that this individual will choose private schools over public schools when public school spending is below y lower bar. If we looked at this individual's preferences only starting at the public school spending level y lower bar I, we would see single peak preferences just as we did in graph 28.1. This is because in graph 28.1 we implicitly assumed there was no private alternative that the individual could choose, and thus would always consume the publicly provided good. In upcoming graphs we will now explore why it is that when voters can have single-peaked preferences, there generally is no such thing as a Condorcet winner, as there was in the median voter theorem, when all voters had single-peaked preferences.